everyone, and welcome back to NetApp On Air. As always, I am your host, Nick Howell. Thank you so much for joining us today for another episode of the show. We got another exciting one for you today. Another piece of technology that ONTAP has that you may not be aware of or you may not be taking advantage of. But before we get into that stuff, a little bit of housekeeping. If you guys haven't joined us yet, make sure you join our Discord community, the now award-winning Discord community. More on that in the future. But yes, over 5,000 strong in that community of your peers. Some of our best partners, solutions architects are in there. Some of our executives even hang out in there, as well as our support staff, our experts, and all of that stuff to help you answer your questions and solve problems and deliver some of our solutions that we have for you. So netappdiscord.com or discord.gg/netapp. If you already have an account, you can just go straight there. Today, we're going to be talking about tiering. Oh, that's one of those four-letter words that a lot of people don't like to talk about. Well, we do things a little bit differently here at NetApp, and we have a guest today returning to the show, and he previously taught me and all of us a lot about flex groups. So much so that I completely wiped my C250 that I had and re-ingested all of the data using a flex group. So that if this episode is as monumental as that one, I might have to be doing some more stuff back here again. But welcome back to the show, Mr. John Lantz. John, how you doing, man?
Hey, Nick. How's it going? Doing well.
It's going good. And I got to say that the flex group thing, like I underestimated that. I will be upfront and honest. That is some of the coolest that we have in ONTAP. Just watching it ingest about 70 terabytes of data and evenly distributed across constituent volumes inside of a single. Actually, I have two flex groups now. So yes, but all in all, like, it has been seamless. I have had zero issues with it.
How are the reads coming back up? A little bit faster?
Say again? Sorry.
How are the reads? After ingest, when you start actually using the data, how are the reads? A little bit faster?
If anything, it feels a little less laggy, a little less latency kind of involved there, because I feel like it's balancing that across the lifts of both controllers. Is that an accurate sort of assumption?
Yeah, I mean, more importantly, it's balancing across the hardware, and you're getting, it's not just the volumes that are balanced across their aggregates, as well as the core on the heads of the controllers. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's just, I don't have any iPerf data or any kind of crazy, like, hard stuff. It's what I refer to as the butt dyno, the feel. Like, it kind of feels different. It feels snappier. It definitely has I can see just in the graphs, the latency. I'm not seeing anything over, like, the most extreme is 5 milliseconds. But I mean, this is Windows shares mostly, so that's pretty par for the course. I'm not doing any, like, structured data Oracle setups or anything like that. So yeah, I mean, just the snapping, and this is all over 10 gig. I'm not even, like, pushing the system to 25 gig. So, like, it's pretty remarkable that just reorganizing the data can have that much of an impact with something like Flex Group and ONTAP. So if you guys haven't seen that episode, definitely click the playlist below, or it'll be right here in the channel. You can go back and watch John's episode on Flex Group from a few weeks ago. Fantastic episode, and I learned all kinds of new stuff, and I hope to do the exact same thing today, because I got an older FAS sitting back there, John, that I may not want to have a bunch of cold, unstructured data sitting on. So I've been looking into ways that I could potentially offload that onto some old spinners, whatever I might have laying around, so that it's not consuming up all of my valuable flash space. Is that kind of a good setup for what we're going to talk about with FabricPool?
We'll chat about. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
So where do you want to start? Do you want to just, like, high level, like, what is tiering, or right into where it's going to make sense, in the rack right behind you, kind of thing?
Well, pretend I'm a prospective customer. I've never run ONTAP before. Explain FabricPool, an ELI5
Sure.
to do a Reddit. Explain it to me like I'm 5. How do you introduce FabricPool to people?
Cool. So at the super high level, like, FabricPool is just moving. It's all part of the active file system. FabricPool is our marketing name for tiering. And to be fair, it's good that it has a separate name, because I think a lot of folks come to tiering and they're thinking like the old school, kind of like this is like an ILM policy, where it's like after 90 days, 180 days, exile my data to Glacier and like more of an archive. And that's not how FabricPool works. FabricPool is super high performance, very dynamic, moving the data around to where you need it. So if you're not touching your data, let's keep it on the HDD where it's like dramatically less expensive than an SSD. But if you are using it, let's keep it on the SSD and we'll move it around. So say I don't touch something for 30 days, we'll move it over to HDD. And if I touch it again, we're going to bring it back and put it back on the SSD because now it's active data, and we want your active data to be ultra low latency, ultra high throughput kind of. So
but for any salty seasoned admin that's out there, we hear the word tiering and we kind of go, no, because there's PTSD associated there, where we're taking entire files, we're taking entire folder structures and things like that, and based on an attribute on those files, they'll get moved off to driven by some policy.
That's never how it worked at NetApp, but that's 100% how it worked in other places where it's like, hey, we're gonna create a stub and move your file somewhere else, and that has serious implications for performance, probably implications for data protection, all of that. With ONTAP, we got lucky and we got to leverage like Waffle. So the Waffle is like our little 4K blocks that live under everything. It's the whole structure of all data inside of ONTAP. And it's been around for 35 years. And we're leveraging that. So instead of being like a file based and having to write stubs and doing all that, we're literally tiering at the Waffle level. So it's not entire files that's getting moved around. It's literally just Waffle blocks that we move around. I can go through the exact like how it works if that would be interesting to you, kind of thing.
Oh, so, absolutely. I would let me pull your slides up here for you, and we can get started. I wanted to set the stage with like what people should expect out of tiering and what it's not. Like this is not your old Legato optical library that's tiering stuff off for archiving and things like that based on file attributes. This is live, active, real-time offloading of cold blocks onto other systems.
And in ONTAP, tiering is all about it's the active file system. So don't think of this as an archive. It's literally just making the active file system less expensive. Like that's really what it is. It's super high performance, but the whole point is if people are coming in like petabyte scales nowadays, and they're doing the numbers and they're upgrading into like new hardware that can do the performance that they're looking for, but it doesn't make sense if 80% of that 2 petabytes is cold data that you got to hang on to for a million different reasons, and it's still part of your active file system. It's not an archive. You still got to touch it from time to time. Let's provision that on an HDD where it's less expensive, so you don't have to provision that entire footprint on SSD. And I think we started changing our way of thinking about that way back in like ONTAP 9.2, so like almost 10 years ago. And now we're up to 9.16 kind of thing, and that's just how people provision a data center nowadays. They don't think about my total footprint has to be 100%, NVMe kind of thing. It's literally the hot active workload should absolutely be on the fastest disk that makes sense for you. But for everything else, again, it's not a set it and forget it. It's very dynamic. So it'll go hot when you need it. And if not, set it on disk that is, again, dramatically less expensive than an SSD.
There's another perspective I want to give people here. So let's say you're looking at either buying your first system, you're looking at an AFF, and because you need to upgrade some stuff, you need a high performance rocket ship to do some whatever it is that your workload is. I want people to start looking at this as part of the buying process, as an add-on to whatever AFF you're looking at, whatever model. Because if you plan for this kind of stuff in advance, think of it like trim levels of a car in a way. Like you're getting an extra added bonus by spending a little bit more to augment the AFF with an additional FAS or some additional shelves, or maybe repurposing an older controller that you have. Think about this through the provisioning process as you're setting up that new AFF or going through the buying process. if
So
you're buying more than one system, we're likely to give you a better deal. I mean,
yeah,
that's just something to think about too.
it's even better than what you're saying, because don't think about it as spending a little bit more. It's actually spending a lot bit less. Is the better way to think
Excellent.
about it. Is you're coming in, say it's time. Say you're a brand new NetApp customer, and you're coming from the competition somewhere, or it's just time for a hardware refresh. It's been 3-4 years. You're ready to jump in to the latest and greatest, A series, C series, whatever. It's going to be all flash nowadays. The best thing you can do before you do that big purchase is just take a look at your existing infrastructure. If you're already on ONTAP, we got a million tools in there in active data reporting, et cetera, to find out what's hot, what's not, and use that to make an intelligent decision about how you're going to provision your next system. If you're coming from somewhere else that you're not, it's not an ONTAP system, you can't use inactive data reporting. That's the inside ONTAP tool that's the most accurate you can get, because literally looking at the waffle blocks, and it uses the same tiering kind of temperature scans. So, but you can do the next best thing, which is and you might even have this, or hopefully you have something like this running on your system already. Any analytics tool worth its salt can look at A time, or the last access time. And that's going to be file-based. It's not 100% as accurate as inactive data reporting, but it gets it really, really close. And it's not surprising. Most customers are 60 to 80% cold data. Obviously you're going to have, certain workloads that are screaming hot all the time. They never cool down. But especially folks with file shares or, like other infrastructure, most of your data isn't ever going to take advantage of flash, because you're just sitting on it. It's a bunch of file shares, for example.
Yeah, if you work at a large corporation and you've got 10,000 users and every single one of them has a home drive, and then all of their various BUs and departments have network shares, the amount of cold data that's sitting on there just waiting for somebody to open the Excel spreadsheet from 5 years ago is monumental, and it's eating away your capacity on your very expensive flash system that you have. And that's really the crux of what we're talking about.
No, absolutely. And every storage admin, they wish it, we could go through and clean all that out, say, hey, I got a hard stop of 2 years or whatever is like a reasonable thing.
Right.
But in the real world, you can't do that. And it's their data, and you gotta provision it. So instead of having to spend that on your most expensive disks that are going to serve your databases and everything, in like the old school mindset of like my entire data center is all one disk type, you don't have to do that anymore. And good news with FabricPool, you haven't for a long time. It's just, this is how people, like, long story short, this is how people think about provisioning a data center nowadays. Is think about, it's not total footprint, it's what's hot, what not, and we're ONTAP is going to take care of like all the storage level magic under the covers in terms of keeping your data where it makes the most sense to your client applications.
Excellent. So let's get into it. Let's get into the gooey geeky details of it, the nuts and bolts of it.
Sure. So
take me down this path.
We can skip through the highest level thing. So again, this came out back in 9.2, so almost 10 years ago now, or maybe it is more than 10. And basically, it was a response to, that was back when customers were just starting to get into SSD-based systems. Like in the early days, most of your system would be HDD, and you might have like a cache, like a flash pool was like one of our products, where you'd have like the SSD cache, but most of the system is HDD. We've kind of flipped that on its head in the last 10 years, where now you provision SSD as your primary, and then we'll tier out or move the data around to HDD to lower cost kind of stuff. So it's like, in the past, it was like you had your flash cache. Nowadays, it's flash first. And it's just a response to where customers wanted us to be, honestly, is, the benefits of SSD are undisputable, and they were 10 years ago, and even more so in 2025. It's just an ultra low latency, ultra high throughput. We got systems that do a terabyte per second kind of thing nowadays. You'll never see that with an HDD. But it costs more than an HDD to get that kind of performance. So again, the whole point is, don't provision that Excel spreadsheet that you got a reference from 2 years ago on an SSD if you don't need to. And so what that looks like from like the 10,000 foot level is, client applications write data to disk. I use a little lightning bolt because it's flash, but that's like most systems nowadays. And like we were saying, most of that footprint of the entire data center. Again, certain workloads are always going to be screaming hot. Most of that's going to be cold. And so what we do with FabricPool is instead of having to provision that entire data center on those expensive disks, let's tier it out. And so that cloud tier is pretty ambiguous here. I think when we started, it was kind of new, and a lot of folks were going to AWS or Azure or Google, those kind of places, where we have our own homegrown object storage grid for customers that are at like petabyte kind of scales, and the economics of a cloud provider don't make sense nowadays. And this has been true since I think like ONTAP 9.8. There's ONTAP S3 where you can just stand up an S3 bucket inside of ONTAP. That was super popular when it first launched. It was crazy popular, and people were just repurposing. It was like, say it's time for a hardware update or upgrade. And they're moving from a FAS to like a brand new A series or something. You could keep your FAS, and that is now the object store. It's local. It's in the rack right next to your stuff. It's all part of the same cluster, and you're just tiering within it. So don't think of this as it has to be a bucket in Amazon. It's really any place, any endpoint that speaks S3. At the end of the day, the whole point of this is this happens automatically. The storage system, ONTAP is taking care of this. You as a storage admin don't have to figure all this out. You can. We have like lots of controls, so different volumes can act completely differently. But it's at its high level, we're just trying to make this really easy. So if you're not touching data, let's move it to disk where it's less expensive. And if you are touching it, we'll move it back to those SSDs. So we're really trying to make it as simple as possible.
So are those tunables like nerd knobs that people can turn on a per volume basis, or is this all like policy driven?
It's policy driven, but they're at the volume level. So it's like, It's basically a parameter that you set on the volume saying, hey, I want this volume to tier, our default's 31 days. So, if no one's touched this data for 31 days, let's move it off somewhere else. Versus you may have like a super automated workload where, I got 2 jobs that are going to hit this data really hard, but they're done after 4 days, for example. Like, why would I need to provision that data on SSD for 31 days if I know all my jobs are done after 4 days? Then I can just set the tiering policy to 5 days on that volume. And so you can have the one volume over here, 31, another 5 days. Something else where you're like, hey, I'm super sensitive. I don't ever want to tier my active data. It maybe, you can't even afford the latency out to the object store, even for cold data. You can do snapshot only. So you can take as many snapshots as you want, knowing that snapshots, your data protection isn't burning capacity on your SSDs. It's, capacity on an HDD where it's totally fine for a restore job kind of thing. But yeah, at the high level, it's lots of options here. But we do try to make it as super simple as possible. And that's true whether you're in System Manager or even CLI. The whole point is we're just trying to reduce costs. We want you, honestly, this is funny coming from us as a storage vendor, but we want you to spend less money on your SSDs. We want you to right size your system so it makes sense for your workloads. Like, we want you absolutely to be on the right disk for your workload, but if you're not touching that data, let's move that over to somewhere where it's less expensive. You have instant access to it. Again, this is not an archive, and I'll show you that in just a second, like how it works, because that's kind of the cool, like where the magic happens, because it is super dynamic. But it's really about just like lowering the cost. So you don't think about having to provision an entire data center on the on SSD, unless your entire data center is screaming hot.
Hey John, I hate to jump in on you. We're getting reports that the slides aren't showing up. We're going to try and do this on the fly, guys. Just to show you we are live. Can we try and stop your share real quick and try to reshare it and see if it comes up that way? I can confirm it's not. The slides aren't coming through in the stream somehow.
No worries.
Sorry, guys. Hang with us for just a second. We want to get this up for you guys.
Cool. So let's try to present. Share my screen. We'll select PowerPoint. Any luck?
Let's see if that brings it up real quick. Hold, please. Nope.
No.
Huh. Okay. Can you send me that deck real quick in Teams?
For sure, for sure. Maybe not in Teams. Can I send it in this
Or
app?
just send me a link to it.
Yeah.
Hang tight with us, guys. We'll get it sorted out.
Bear with it for
Live
being
troubleshooting.
Let me.
It was showing initially, and then when we took it down off the screen and put it back, it didn't come back up.
Oh,
and I don't know if
no.
that's a StreamYard thing or what's going on there.
Okay. Let's try to get this over to you.
We'll see if it makes a difference. Oh, come on, phone.
So I'm over in Teams. Let's see if I can drag this over.
So this is a good chance for you guys to throw your questions in the chat for John once we get this all sorted out. We'll have to go back a little bit and maybe show the animation because it's a beautiful animation. Let's see. Open in browser. And I guess I can stick that over here. And I'm going to share from there.
Cool. Do you want me to stop sharing the screen here?
No, you can leave yours there.
Okay.
Let's see if mine works. So we're going to share screen. Entire screen. That one. Share.
There we go. I see something.
All right. So what I'm going to do
More importantly,
is
folks,
I'm going to back up a little bit because I want people to see this. I want people to see this animation because this is really cool as to, you know, how the things that you were talking. Yeah, I'm really blown out right now by all the white light too. That's interesting. So I want people to see this animation because as you were talking through it, apologies everybody. Thanks for hanging with us. The way that we talk about tiers, I think is really important. And you know, when we talk about it in the context of how we architect things, we use the word tiers. But a lot of this is, you know, synonymous with how we talk about aggregates in, you know, if you're working with the command line or you're building systems in ONTAP. So I don't want people to be confused by the word tier here.
Sure. So internally, maybe this would help folks wrap their head around it. Internally, we think of FabricPool as a composite aggregate. Is another way to think about it. Where it's, don't think of it again like the wrong way to think about this is old school kind of, you know, information lifecycle management, where I'm after X amount of time, I'm just archiving or exiling this data to some other location. All we're doing here is basically creating a composite aggregate of your SSD and HDD. The HDD just lives somewhere else. It's all part of the same active file system. You have instant access to that data. You know, technically, we're not tiering metadata, inodes, you know, ACLs, directory structures. Like there's some amount of like non-user data that just never ever gets tiered. So that's always 100% flash. But say if I have to reach out to the actual file, you know, the other 95% of a file, then I'm reaching out to that object store and getting the data from an HDD rather than an SSD. I'll walk through what that looks like in a second because again, it's not. We didn't exile the data anywhere. It's very dynamic. If you're touching it, we're going to bring it right back and write it to SSD because we're expecting if you touch it once or read it once, you're probably going to read it again. We want that next read to be full speed flash kind of thing. So it's not, don't think it's absolutely not archive. We're not exiling the data anywhere. It's just the active file system on different types of disk it's
almost like it's dealing cards to different disk types, disk pools as you have them assigned. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. So shall we go to the use cases?
Sure. I'll let you click through.
Yeah, there you go.
So we have a bunch of different policies. If when we started, 10 years ago, it was our very first release was kind of like, let's just do snapshots. We wanted to be super safe. We weren't sure how this was all going to work out. And so this is, as customers take more and more snapshots, especially on SSD, where they're crossing 10%, 15%, because it's not like we do weeklies anymore. Like, I don't know anyone that doesn't do at least dailies, if not, hourlies or sub-hourlies now. All that takes up capacity, especially if you're making big changes. Snapshots are super efficient, but a huge delete is still a big delta. And we got to record that so you can restore to, next or last Tuesday's kind of data set if you need to. you don't have to provision that on SSD is where we kind of started on our very first release. Very few people use this anymore, just because, maybe 15% of 80% opportunity isn't that large. Where I see people using Snapshot nowadays is mostly SAN customers, where like they're using SAN for a reason, and it's probably for super high performance. So they don't want any of their data to get tiered. But they're absolutely cool, like moving off 10, 15% with those snapshots kind of thing. The next is auto. This covers snapshots as well, but it's everything else. And this is where you get that huge benefit of tiering, where, here it's like 50%. Honestly, most customers, it's going to be closer to 80. Most customers are well over 60% of their data center. This is going to be, your, NFS, SMB shares, CIF shares, et cetera, and everything else, where it's just like, hey, I'm sitting on this data set. Maybe it's not a share. Maybe it's just, some engineering project from 2 years ago that has essential data that other people are still going to reference, but they're probably not writing to it anymore because it's a 2-year-old project. Let's provision that somewhere, instant access to it, but it's not sitting on the SSD.
Yeah.
The next one, so all these are adjustable. Again, 31 days is our default. You can dial this up or down, kind of like I was saying earlier. Most customers, most customers don't change it at all, but those that do are almost always because it's an automated, like super highly automated workload, and like why sit on it for longer than I have to.
And this is data we're collecting through auto supports, right? That we can see, anonymized how people are, the uptake, how they're configured, on all that kind of stuff. Like, so when you say most people are just leaving it on auto, is that based on that data?
Correct.
Yeah.
So we know how we've tiered more than an exabyte of data now, or our customers have. We watch and see how people use that, and we actually make adjustments based on that. Like, that's one of the best, for me at least, best parts of NetApp in general, is we're really responsive to how customers are using data. And that's not just, our own internal analytics. That's like, literally daily conversations with different customers about how we can improve stuff. Where I was going with the high numbers, because a lot of folks are going to see 183 and they're like, oh, well, how come I can't do 365 kind of thing? So again, just need to reset what we're doing with FabricPool or tiering and ONTAP is, again, it's not an archive. It's not ILM. Don't think about it as old school, like, hey, after a year, move my data somewhere else. Again, it's super high performance, very dynamic. The higher you raise it, and I'll show you because of how this works in a second, because it's so high performance and dynamic, the higher you raise that number, the less you actually will be tiering and the less value you get. So again, most people never change it off of 31. Those that do generally dial it down. Every now and then you run into, and that high number, that like 180 kind of number, that's not because of a storage engineer, asked for that. That was an executive mandate that said, hey, I want everything provisioned on SSD, no matter what, for 180 days kind of stuff. So we'll honor that. It might not be the most efficient or cost-saving thing, but it made that customer happy.
So we had our first question come in from Heino, and you mentioned HDDs and stuff previously, so I want to make sure that we clarify: is this only something that works on AFFs?
No.
To tier down to S3, or can this be used with FAS down to another level? Like,
so it works A series, C series, even a FAS on all HDD. The one thing I point out is like the whole point of this is to reduce costs, and so tiering from HDD to HDD isn't really saving that much money. You're actually incurring a little bit of latency because of we got to pull it from the object store out on the grid, but in general, HDD to HDD is going to reduce performance without giving you those big cost savings. I'm not saying I've never seen it. Generally, it's where your data center or the power that goes into the data center, you've capped that out, and you physically can't draw more power at the site, or you've run out of racks to you can't add additional shelves. And then I see customers tiering from HDD to HDD, like a FAS out to a bucket somewhere. But I'll be honest, that's kind of an edge case. It's kind of rare. In general, it's not that we can't, it's just that the economics of it, like don't make as much sense as going. You see big savings going from an SSD to HDD, not so much going from spinning to spinning.
Yeah. Ollie chimed in. FabricPool's awesome, and it's the gateway drug to storage grid. I thought that was really clever and really funny. Well done. Welcome to the show, Ollie, all the way from Germany.
Yeah, Oliver is totally right. So a lot of folks they started storage grid because of FabricPool, where they're like, hey, I because it's all HDD and they're at a scale where that totally makes sense. And then a year, maybe 2 years later, someone's asking, hey, like I wish we had S3 on site, and they're like, no, what we already do. And so boom, that's a super common use case is they start with FabricPool and then realize they have an enterprise class object store ready and waiting, like already installed, ready to go.
Yeah. One more real quick. For CVO, we use tier all, and in our colo sites today, we use tier auto. Yeah. Guys, this doesn't just apply to physical systems either. A lot of this stuff works up in the cloud. It's on tap at the end of the day. On tap is on tap is on tap.
It's on tap anywhere. So we're seeing CVO, so that's cloud volumes on tap for everybody else. But this is true for on-prem. It's true for cloud volumes on tap. It's true for the first-party services like Amazon FSxN. It's even true. I haven't seen this in a while, but I have seen this. ONTAP Select is like our virtualized ONTAP. I've seen people tiering from the top of telephone poles. So like if you can run ONTAP there, you could tier from that location. So yeah.
Wow. Awesome. All right. So where do we go from here?
Sure. I think there's one more, just like the all. So in general, when we started, all used to be called backup. And for a secondary site, so like your backup site, why wait X number of days at all? It's a backup, so we'll just tier everything instantly. There's a couple edge cases where customers will say, or the storage admin will say, hey, I know this project isn't going to ever be touched again, or this BU like only deserves HDD kind of thing. So they'll say this volume is everything tiers off of it. What we don't want customers to do though is treat object. So all this at the end of the day is object storage is how we do it. And I'll get to that like block level and object level in a second. Object isn't transactional. So you got to write a brand new object every single time. So we don't want you treating object like NAS. So this works exceptionally well for reads, but writes or deletes, et cetera, will fragment tiered data over time. So we don't want you to say, hey, it's just really cheap, and so I set it to all. All makes sense for projects that are done and complete kind of stuff. Don't try to like save money by treating object like a transactional file system kind of thing. So that's the only exception there. It's honestly, it's much better purposed for folks that tier off of a backup site, where folks tier off their primary, save a ton of money, but maybe they're saving money on the backup as well, or like DR sites and those kind of things.
Yeah, cool. So this is kind of what I think a lot of people are really interested in is it's great to kind of theory craft about what you could do with your environment and how you could put this into practice. But I really want to understand kind of the nuts and bolts of
the underlying mechanics of how it works. Yeah. So again, super high level, we're just trying to save money. That's the whole point of tiering. The magic, and kind of like where you're saying you have some PTSD from other systems, is the way the industry, and this is honestly still true today, the way most people do tiering is file-based, where they're going to have a file, then they move the entire file somewhere else, and hopefully they're not using stubs anymore, but people still do stubs, and they might write a brand new file on the system that points to the old one. We don't have to do any of that in ONTAP. We're just leveraging Waffle under the covers. Our system is not file-based. I don't think anybody else is doing it like that. And it has some significant advantages. We'll get to that in just a second. At the highest level, we're taking an aggregate. So that's like your local tier in System Manager. And we're basically just attaching that to a bucket. So that bucket can be anywhere that speaks S3. In general, and again, I'm not the dollars and cents guy. I'm just like the how it works guy. But from my experience, sub 300 terabytes, it's probably going to make more sense out to an Amazon, Azure, etc. The costs are probably less than standing up a brand new FAS or a storage grid or something like that. So, and again, we're pretty agnostic. We're here to make the experience good for the customer. So, if Azure, Amazon, Google, whoever makes more sense, go for that. Like it's going to work great. And it's all about saving money.
If I've got an older FAS, John, like are there limitations on ONTAP versions of what can be a destination for FabricPool?
You got to be 9.8. So that's where we started ONTAP S3. Yeah.
Okay.
So good news, that's kind of old at this point in time.
Yeah.
But yeah, so previous to that, we do file on block and we didn't do object, but nowadays we do object in ONTAP. So that's super common nowadays where it's kind of, we fell in the middle where it's like, if you're super small, 100 terabytes, 200 terabytes, go to a cloud provider. If you're a little bit above that, which most of enterprise customers are nowadays, ONTAP S3 is going to make a lot of sense, especially if you already pay for the hardware. Like if you're doing an upgrade from FAS into brand new flash with C series or A series or something, like the thing you paid for 4 years ago is cheaper than anything new, and it's like you already own it. So ONTAP S3 is kind of that sweet spot in between there. Then eventually you're going to cross over into like petabyte scales, and we have customer tiering like double, triple digit petabytes nowadays. And for those customers, storage grid might make more sense just because it can get way bigger than an ONTAP platform. ONTAP is still, even if as totally decked out, is 24 nodes maximum. And so for those customers that are pushing out, storage grid is a good option too.
Any architecture requirements, or does it have to be in the same cluster? Like, is there any considerations to think of when you're sort of architecting this?
It normally is in the same cluster, but it doesn't have to be. We do have customers where it's like, hey, I have site A in this location, site B in another location, and they're tiering to site C somewhere else. So that's less common than just like having it in the rack right next to you kind of thing. But it's totally an option.
So can multiple AFFs from different sites tier to the same FAS or storage grid system?
Yes. They can't share data. So the next question is, can they share data? So like all the data is in the same bucket. And so, my snapshots here work over here. It doesn't work that way. We're only cluster aware at the end of the day. So it can absolutely be on the same system, but it'll be bucket A serves site A and bucket B serves site B.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool.
And that's true for storage grid as well as ONTAP S3. Technically anywhere, so even Amazon, Azure, etc. Basically, each cluster at the end of the day is going to have its own bucket. One of the advantages to this, I don't know if you've heard of optimized vol moves, but so say you have a cluster, like say it's like a 4-node cluster with multiple aggregates in it. If I or it's a brand new system and I'm bringing in new hardware and it's I'll add my new nodes and I vol move over. An optimized vol move is when all the aggregates inside that cluster point to the same bucket. So the cold data doesn't have to move at all. It just sits at rest in that bucket, and only the hot data has to move in that vol move. So super efficient, doesn't create all this additional network traffic. So that's a neat trick that we can do. And that's just following a best practice of, you normally want every agger in your cluster to point to the same location.
Yeah.
You don't have to. We have weird edge cases where, there might be BU, his agreement with Amazon, and BU number 2 has some agreement with Azure, and they want to go to other locations. So as long as their data is on different aggregates, they can do that. That's super rare, though. In general, most people do everything in the cluster goes to a single bucket.
I wanted to throw a question up here from OG because I think it's pertinent and timely. He loves FabricPool, but he also loves his tamper-proof snapshots. Is there a world where both can exist at the same time?
Not today. That's not today's world. So the magic with tamper-proof snapshots is, think of it's like a worm snapshot where we're not going to let you modify this whatsoever. So they're super resistant to ransomware and other things. The gotcha with FabricPool is 2 things. Is one, we're tiering the data somewhere else. And number 2 is when we have to write data back. Like we're going to unreference the data out in the object store. We basically do defrag and clean up like you would expect. You can't do that with Worm. So if we're never allowed to delete those blocks, eventually, they're going to start taking up additional capacity and resources out on the object store, even if it's unreferenced, by ONTAP, just because we've said you're not allowed to delete that for whatever that time period is. So it's just to be able to do that, we'd have to break our commitment to tamper-proof snapshots, and so we're not going to let you do that, especially for enterprise stuff, because there's a million security agreements that are kind of in place that says we're committing to these standards, and we don't want to break those standards. So that's why it's not allowed. Yeah.
I do think there's a world where we could figure out how to specifically have a mechanism. So with snapshot only, where you could check a box and it could move your tamper-proof snapshots, but only tamper-proof snapshots. Like we would have to keep them. Hi, Kitty. We would have to keep them confined somehow. I know. Do they want to be a guest on the show? Well, we can talk about tiering cat food and stuff. I do think there's a world we can figure that out. OG, I guess is what I'm saying. Yeah. I wouldn't rule it out. But I agree with John that that's tricky because of all of the things that we have promised our customers, and a lot of those are very secure agencies. And if we start going in and monkeying around with stuff now, it goes back on what we promised.
Yeah,
I know exactly, Kitty.
The gotcha, I think, and where we're thinking about it is okay, maybe we don't tier the TPS snapshots. What if they stay local, but we tier everything else? Because today it's kind of a block on all the data in the volume. Not just if you have TPS enabled, it means nothing can tier out of there. That's where we might see some traction in the future.
Yeah. Additional snapshots in addition to the TPS, it might be
or the non-snapshot data, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Right. Ready to move on to the next?
Yeah. So let's get to the cool part. So honestly, this isn't even the cool. The cool part's when we're reading the data, because that's where the magic happens. Or we leverage Waffle, and it's so different from file-based systems. But just so you understand how this works. Client application writes data to disk. So exactly the same as always. In the background, we're running temperature scans, 24/7 through here. And we're not looking at a file, we're not looking at a time on a file or anything. We're literally looking at the Waffle blocks to see, have you touched it or not? Why that's important is because sometimes, especially for customers that have, gigabyte or terabyte size files nowadays, they're not necessarily touching the whole file when they touch it. So some of that data might be super cold because they haven't touched it. It's on a layer that they haven't touched, versus others, it's still hot. So we're looking and we're just rolling through temperature scans in the background, and we're seeing, does that align with the setting that you put on the volume? So again, 31 days is our default. After that, so that's happening all the time in the background. After that, a daily scan kicks off, and it basically goes through and collects all the cold blocks. That'd be the next one. And we're just super simple. We're saying, are you hot or not? If you're not, we're going to grab you and stick you into an object. And then we do a put out to the object store. For, object stores that aren't, in the rack right next to you or part of the same cluster kind of stuff, we're always going to make sure that is encrypted and all that goodness. But it's just S3. It's just a put. They're pretty tiny in terms of how the objects are. So it's not super exciting there. The exciting is when the read comes in. So if we skip ahead to how we get back, one thing to point out for folks that are brand new to FabricPool, this used to be one of the number one things is we don't tier anything unless your aggregate is at least 50% full. That is an adjustable number kind of thing. So if you're greenfield and you absolutely want to start tiering stuff right away, but that used to be when we first launched, that was our number one FabricPool issue was they turn it on, a greenfield customer, and they say, hey, nothing's tiering. How come this happened? It's well, you haven't even got to 50% full. Why tier stuff, use the network traffic, or Amazon's going to charge you for data in their bucket? Why even do that if you have all the capacity in the world kind of thing?
Sizing planning, honestly, if I'm putting my IT hat on for a second, that extends the refresh cycle for me of time that I have to upgrade or mostly scale up. I could do a head swap in the meantime instead of like completely refreshing an entire system, but that gives me a better idea, runway, I guess you would say, if I'm tiering already. If I have to wait till I get to 50%, like that's going to be okay. So it's 50% and then runway.
Yeah,
But I like the idea of kind of turning it on and seeing what ends up happening as the data migrates in plus 30 days. That would give me a real good idea of that.
And honestly, most customers don't play with this setting, but it's there. This is the default setting. Back in the day, I saw more customers play with it, especially Greenfield. They're going to dial it down because they just want stuff to. I want to see tiering happening, or that first year maybe where people were when FabricPool was brand new, and they weren't sure. They're just like, I don't know how this is really going to work. They might dial it up really high, where it's like, hey, I'm going to use this as a pressure valve, like at 80% or something. But if not, then I don't want to kind of take that risk. We're way past that now. This is nowadays people just build their systems like this. So let's get to the reading the data, because here's huge difference from us and honestly everybody else. So here, client application read comes in. Your client application, if the data's never got tiered, it's full speed flash, just like you would expect, sub 2 millisecond, whatever. And that's true even for cold data, if it's like the metadata or the inodes or ACLs, directory structures, I do an LS or something, that's full speed flash, like, because we never tier that information kind of stuff. If it's the actual file data and we got to reach out and get it, then we're going to do a reach out, a get operation out to the S3 bucket. Here's where kind of the magic happens, and the advantage of using Waffle is we don't get the whole file. We don't even get the whole object. We can literally do byte range gets all the way down to 4K. So it depends on what you need. And we're going to do a lot of them. So it's all concurrent. We're going to hit that object store really hard because we want it to go fast. But we don't have to bring the whole file. And I'll be honest, like if I'm opening up a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint or PDF or something, that's not going to matter. But for customers with gigabyte size files, terabyte size files, where they're not touching the whole thing, like say I got this isn't even that big anymore, but say I got like a 5 gig file and I'm only touching 200 megs of it. If I'm using a file-based system, I have to bring all 5 gigs over the wire. So even if that's to ONTAP S3 or storage grid, that's still network traffic. If that's out to Amazon, Azure, Google, whoever, they're going to charge you for that 5 gigs.
You're paying egress per gigabyte, right?
And 0.0002 cents like doesn't sound like a lot, but at terabyte or petabyte scale, that like adds up. So we don't want to have to move all that data over. So something I didn't mention is like it's so ONTAP the whole time. So it's the storage efficiencies, everything else is just ONTAP. So all that still applies. We want the data to be as small as we can. But just like we're trying to make data storage efficient in terms of like how much footprint and capacity it takes up, we want it to be network efficient when those reads come in. So we're not bringing back the whole file. When that read comes in, so the next part is, so number one, we're not bringing back the whole file unless the client application needs it, then we absolutely will. But if it doesn't, whatever those blocks are, those waffle blocks are that correspond to the file, we're going to write them back to the SSD, because we're going to make the crazy assumption that if you touched it right now, you're probably going to touch it again for whatever reason. And we want that very next touch to be full speed flash, to again be sub 2 milliseconds or whatever your expectations are on your system. So we write the data back to the SSD. So again, it's not...
And it resets that clock on the policy, right? So if it's 30 days, it's going to keep it there for another 30 days until it becomes cold again, right?
Absolutely. So again, don't think of this as, set it and forget it kind of ILM. We've exiled the data. It's always going to be cold for forever. It's if you need the data, you have instant access to it, and we're going to put it where it belongs. So if you're touching data, we want it on the SSD. If you're not touching the data, we want it on the much, much less expensive HDD. So we write it back here. And then, if, to your point, after 31 days, if no one's touching it, we're going to tier it back out. So again, it's very dynamic, very high performance, very network efficient. And so those are all kind of the benefits of here. It's It's not old school ILM. We expect you to use this with your active file system. There's no stubs or any kind of weirdness on your data protection. Data protection works identical with or without FabricPool. Like and that's true whether it's SnapMirror or Veeam or Commvault or whoever, you're protecting data in the volume. So it's not about hot data or cold data. It's the data in the volume gets protected just like it always did.
It's one of the reasons I don't really like talking about this in the context of tiering, even though that's what it is, because tiering tends to fall over the data protection, disaster recovery umbrella. That's really not what this is.
Yeah, people think archive, because that's how it used to be.
This is an economics conversation, more than anything.
This is just
it's an efficiency conversation.
Yeah, it's a modern way to provision a data center. Really, it is. Yeah.
Cool.
Next one. So we talked about writing it back. I did want to show, this next one right there, the auto. So the important part here is, in general, we're going to write the data back to the SSD when you read it, because we want it to go fast. So we're giving it that performance boost. Even though it's cold data, it's not cold anymore. Let's put it on the SSD. We don't do that. Again, all this is adjustable depending on your workload. But for the vast majority of customers, sequential reads are things that they wouldn't want the data to be coming back anyway. So say it's a deep file scan or an indexer or something like that. You don't want to leave on Friday, your deep file scan kicks off, and you come back on Monday and your SSDs are all full because we wrote everything back. So good news, by default, we don't do that. So ONTAP's had for 20 plus years, it's a cool patented algorithm actually. We've had sequential read ahead, which is just makes ONTAP go faster, and it's been there forever. FabricPool or tiering piggybacks on that technology. So when sequential read ahead is triggered, it raises a flag and says, hey, stop your write backs. We're just going to go super fast for the reads. So we're just leveraging that. There are a couple use cases where customers do turn this off. I normally see it with AI or ML, where it's like it is 100% sequential workload, and they do want it to come back to go faster. So there are settings that you can go just at that volume. You can say, hey, I want this volume to make sequential reads right back. But in general, most customers like the default setting kind of thing. Last but not least, you as an admin can just say, hey, I don't want any of this data to come back. And for whatever reason that you have, you can just say this data just lives on the HDDs nowadays, kind of thing. Again, that works better for reads. We still don't want transactional operations hitting the object store. And it's not that anything bad happens when it does. It just means we're going to have to do more defrag operations, et cetera, cleanup. Takes longer, kind of stuff. That's all.
Well, you mentioned something about turning this off. Just a hypothetical, in the event that you needed to evacuate the cloud tier, whichever system or method you were using, is that just turning off the FabricPool service and it will re-ingest everything back into the primary system?
Almost. So it's two things. It's one, you turn it off. So basically, I want no new tiering to take place, and it doesn't have to be the whole thing. You can just do this on an individual volume even. But you basically say, hey, turn off tiering on this volume, and then there's a thing called the cloud retrieval policy, and you can basically set that to promote all the data back. And it basically says no new tiering is going to happen, and anything that already got tiered comes back to the local SSDs.
Rewarm everything, if you will.
Yeah. It's super easy. In the olden days, before cloud retrieval existed, and I want to say that was like 9.12 or 9.14. Even that's been around for a while now. So again, just so everyone knows, FabricPool is extremely mature product. That's just how people provision data centers nowadays, because it works so well. So even these things that I'm talking about is like a new feature that came out 3 years ago, kind of thing. It works really well. But before that, in the really olden days, like 8 years ago or something, you'd have to do a vol move, is kind of the old fashioned way of doing it. You turn off tiering and then vol move to somewhere and then bring all the data back. Yeah. It's like, why, especially if you don't have a footprint on another agger to do that, that was a hassle. So that's why you can just click the cloud retrieval button nowadays and it comes right back.
So if I've got, let's say I've got a fast 2650 that's sitting back there, the max on tap it'll run is 9.10, I think, is what I've been able to upgrade it to. I've got a C250. Do I need to put that in the same cluster? Do I point that at?
Just because the versions are so different, you'll probably have a hard time getting it in the same cluster, just because it's a weird mixed version of ONTAP. So instead, it doesn't have to be the same cluster. It can be a completely standalone cluster that says, hey, it's just, at the end of the day, it's just a bucket. The difference being setup, I'd say, is a tiny bit easier when it's all in the same cluster. And when it's in the same cluster, you get to take advantage of, it's going to use cluster lifts to move the data. Versus if you're in a different cluster, the client side of FabricPool is going to use IC lifts, and then the server side ONTAP S3 on your FASs would use data lifts. And so you get a little TLS handshake and CA certs and that kind of stuff. So you get a tiny bit more latency when it's a different cluster than just in the same one. But other than that, it works equally well. Yeah.
Awesome. Fantastic. Do we have any more slides? Oh, we have one more thing in there.
Oh, last one before we say like what to think about. So just like our default is we're not going to tier anything until 50%. And again, that number is adjustable. This number is not adjustable. We stopped all these write backs are just there to make your what was previously cold data go faster. And it's just there by default. Because again, if you're touching data, we want it on your SSDs. We turn that off, and this number is not adjustable. We're not going to let you, shoot yourself in the foot, accidentally. Once you get to 90%, the write backs stop. The reads always happen, so you're always reading this data. It's just now it's at the speed of HDD for that cold data versus triggering that write back, which is going to make it go faster. What we don't want, here's the whole reason for this, is if you're at 90%, like you've already been getting EMS messages for a while now saying, hey, you're running low on capacity. We don't want to burn out that last 10% on your expensive SSDs by just making cold data go faster. We want that for brand new writes that are coming in. Like you already got capacity issues if you're at 90%. So let's not do a performance booster. Let's preserve that for brand new writes as you go start making those POs for additional shelves, etc.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, I can't reiterate enough, like make this part of your buying process. Like this has to be part of it. It isn't just about replacing a primary storage system or refreshing a primary storage system. This has to be a bolt-on for almost any new NetApp system that you get.
Yep,
like,
and so that's
consider it a prerequisite at this point.
So check out the next slide. I'm hoping it's the IDR slide. So support systems is everything.
Yeah, on tap. Period.
Yeah, again, like ONTAP Select, we have people tiering from telephone poles and under the seats of tanks and stuff. But if it's ONTAP, it's tiering. I
hope you know how random that sounded. I love it. Under the seats of tanks and things.
Yeah. Well, you got very little capacity in those like hardened boxes. So let's move it out. So anywhere that speaks ONTAP is good. So don't worry about that part. On that previous slide, the one conversation I'd have is normally there's a license involved if you're going to a non-NetApp endpoint. So zero license when you go to ONTAP S3. So that's like probably on a FAS or out to Storage Grid, which is our enterprise class object store. Pretty much everywhere, and there's no license when you're inside of a NetApp environment. So say a Cloud Volumes ONTAP or a FSXN, something like that. Where there is a license involved is if you're tiering from ONTAP to a bucket in Amazon or Azure or Google or wherever. It's less of a consideration nowadays just because most of our customer base is at a scale where the economics don't always make sense. But that being said, there's customers that are tiering petabytes out to Amazon, Azure, etc. So for those, they have a locked-in contract because it's .gov or whatever. Yeah. We totally support that. If the economics make sense to you, we 100% support those endpoints as well. The most important is that next slide. This has been around since 9.4. It's been around for a very long time. If you're in an ONTAP system and you're thinking about upgrading, 100%, please, look at inactive data reporting. It's automatically on in System Manager for your SSDs. You got to turn it on if you're on an HDD, and it literally lets you know what's hot, what's not, what can you tier. It is using the FabricPool temperature scans to do its work, and it's going to let you know what that looks like. So when you're making that decision about what does my next environment, how am I going to provision that, use these numbers, because that's how much SSD you really need versus how much you can provision on HDD. Again, just like we were saying, like really early on, is if you're not on ONTAP and you're thinking about moving to ONTAP, you can't use IDR, but we at NetApp have a tool, XCP, that looks at A time. You might even have this, you might have any analytics tool nowadays, or for many years now, collects last access on files. So you might even be able to already have this data and just run a report to see what that looks like in a non-ONTAP system. It's not perfect like IDR is, but it gets it really, really close.
Yeah. Cool. Let's see, a couple questions coming in here towards the end. Is FabricPool supported with ActiveSync?
Ooh, I don't think so. I don't think so. I couldn't tell you why on that one. For most data protection, except for TPS or like worm kind of based things, it totally works. I don't know. It might be because of latency involved with ActiveSync. I'm not certain. But I don't
track down Mr. Steiner.
Yeah.
And then Ollie threw another one in. How can you see what the tiering scanner is doing? That's the right direction here.
It's hidden from you. So yeah, you can't. We're trying to make it simple. Technically there's probably like some diag level commands you could dive into, but we don't want customers to be touching that. What happens is it's running in the background of the system at all times. It's using some compute resources. Kitty's not happy about that, but it's like 3, maybe 4% or something. It's not noticeable unless you're pegging your system at 100%. Then maybe it'd be noticeable. Most customers aren't. That's why we do ask, that's why for SSDs it's on by default, but for HDD we want you to understand you're going to turn it on, just because what's not noticeable on an SSD is probably going to be noticeable on an HDD kind of thing.
Gotcha. Good question, Ollie. All right, there we go.
Here we go.
So, John, to close things out here, as we did at the beginning, sort of recap like who should consider FabricPool, who are good candidates for it, and I want to say anybody that's running any ONTAP system, kind of as a blank open thing.
Like honestly, if you run Flash in your system, you should be thinking about FabricPool. It will lower costs. It will like right size your environment in terms of what needs to be provisioned on SSD versus what doesn't. That's the whole point. And so it really, unless you're 100% FAS HDD kind of customer, and those customers exist, and that's okay. Again, tiering HDD to HDD, probably not going to save a lot of money. You have to be some weird edge case where it's just like, I can't add more shelves in my system, or I can't draw more power, kind of thing. I've seen both. But those are super rare. In general, it doesn't make sense economically, HDD to HDD. But for everybody else, which is literally almost everybody else nowadays, especially, I think people were on the fence, back when it was just, FabricPool helped people get into A-Series just that would have never been able to do that in general, just because they're looking at, sizing their entire environment for an SSD when they really didn't need to. Nowadays, C-Series brings that entry level on Flash down dramatically. But even then, C-Series Flash, it's still more expensive than HDD. So anyone that's working with SSD, I would absolutely take a look at inactive data reporting, see what that looks like in your environment, because that's for most customers, that's significant cost savings.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, John, thanks again, man. I know you did a back-to-back here for over a course of a month, I think, on both Flex Groups and FabricPool. So
cool.
Really appreciate it.
We'll do S3 next.
What's that?
S3 next.
Yes, ONTAP S3 is definitely on deck for sure. I even got to get the storage guy.
Which
I got to go get Ben from Storage Grid on here too.
in context of FabricPool, that's how you tier to a FAS. Is you stand up an object store in ONTAP. Funny enough, it has crossover with all three of these products. Is ONTAP S3 is a flex group under the covers because that's our favorite container of choice. Spreads everything across the cluster. And that then becomes the bucket that you're tiering from. So your A series or C series tiers to a bucket. It's all ONTAP to ONTAP. But yeah, it's still an object store inside of ONTAP.
I was taking a quick peek, just a little anecdotal thing here at the end. As you know, when you did your Flex Group episode, I talked about at the beginning, I re-ingested all of mine. And there are it's a 2-node cluster, C250. There's 2 aggregates. And I just went to look at mine. There's about, I think it's split off, there's about 40 terabytes on each side, on each aggregate, right? Just looking at the first one, 16.7 terabytes inactive data. There's just, and mine is all unstructured stuff, for just to give it sort of, an example, a real life example. So yeah, using the combination of flex groups, and in the coming weeks, I'm going to have that 2650 stood back up and set up FabricPool and do some stuff on that. There's going to be all kinds of stuff that I'm going to be able to move off of. I just hope I have enough disks to be able to take advantage of that FAS in a FabricPool situation. So that's something I've got to sort out. Yeah. But yeah, sit right there. Over half, 50% of that one aggregate is inactive cold data.
And that's not unusual. Like, it's funny, like when we first started FabricPool, like many years ago, customers would like fight you on that. They're like, there's no way I have that much cold data. And you're like, okay, let's run some reports. And nowadays, I think it's just industry wide. Everybody knows they're sitting on a ton of cold data. But I think 10 years ago, I think it was shocking people to find out how much they're sitting on. Yeah.
If you guys want to know where to see that on your systems, you can go into System Manager. It's under Storage Tiers, and then on each aggregate, you click the little 3-dot next to it and go to More Details, and that's where it'll show you the little graph. It's kind of buried under 3 levels of steps there to get to it, but it's there, and you guys can see it in real time. So go check your systems out and get FabricPool set up and give it a shot.
And if you're thinking about, say you're still on a FAS today and you're ready to take your first steps into SSD, turn on IDR on your aggregates. You'll get the exact same report, and then you'll basically now you're ready to have that conversation with whoever about, hey, this is actually how much SSD we really need, and maybe I can repurpose the FAS that I'm already sitting on as my object store for that SSD.
Yeah, awesome. Well, John, thank you so much again for being here for going over this with us. We'll have you on again soon for ONTAP S3, but as always, it's been a pleasure, my friend.
Sounds good. Good to see you, Nick.
All right, take care. All right, guys. Well, there we go. Coming up in the coming weeks, we've got more episodes coming your way. NVIDIA GTC is happening this month. We've got Google Cloud Next. They change the name of it all the time. So their show's happening here in coming weeks. Lots of shows coming, and it's getting into the spring. It's time to go. We got to go for the year. I am definitely looking forward to setting up some more stuff with FabricPool. That is fantastic, and it was very eye-opening for me to just go over there and look at my own setup and just see that there's 17 terabytes of cold, that literally half of each of my aggregates is inactive cold data that I could pull off and have more capacity on my AFF C-Series to do that. So that's something we're going to be working on getting done. If you haven't joined us yet, get into the Discord community, now award-winning Discord community, according to our super producer and community manager, Mr. Drew Claybrook this morning. We have won awards for Discord and our general community efforts here at NetApp. So make sure you come and join us. Lots of folks hang out in there. It's a great place to get problems solved, get questions answered, blog posts, product updates and alerts, all kinds of good stuff. NetAppDiscord.com, or if you already have an account, discord.gg/NetApp, and you can jump right in. But folks, as always, my name is Nick Howell. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to get out of here. Apologies for the little snafus with the slide sharing. We got to go look into that and figure out what happened there. But my name is Nick Howell. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week. Take care.